Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's BAInsights session. And today we're going to be talking about who are your business analysis stakeholders. Once again, I've got some excellent guests to join me and talk through that very topic. If you're new to the channel and you haven't subscribed before, please do that. As always, if you've got any comments, anything you want to add, share your own perspective, that's always really interesting as well. So please drop a note in the comments and we'll have a look and see what you've got to share. Aside from that, before we dive into the detail, really good to go through some introductions. So Lee, perhaps if we could start with yourself, please.
Yeah, thanks, John. Hello, everyone. My name is Lee Anderson. So I'm currently a business analyst, work for the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology and the GDS team. Been a BA for roughly 20 plus years, broad range across public and private sector. Yeah, really looking forward to this. So thanks for the invite, John.
Welcome, Lee. Yeah, good to see you. And Orla, same for you for your introduction, if you would as well, please.
Sure. I'm Orla Desmond. I work for an NGO called MapAction, and we specialise in geospatial information systems and data, providing response globally. And I've been in the role about a year, just over a year and 3 months now. I'm quite new to the humanitarian sector, so it's been an amazing journey so far. And I'm a returner. I was formerly a BA for a few years, working in telecoms and a couple of other areas. So I'm really pleased to be here today. Thanks for having me, John.
Excellent. It's always nice to speak to people from different parts of the world or the country or in different sectors as well. So always good to get guests on and share your perspectives. So let's dive into the first question if we can. I'll start with you, Lee, really, in terms of who are your key stakeholders, and who are your key stakeholders or groups really that you're involved in your change initiatives or projects?
Yeah, I think for me, I always look at this in two groups, John, in terms of the level of role that I'm partaking in. So predominantly a standard BA and a change initiative, or whether I'm doing a senior or lead role. I think the base and the core stays the same. So, you think about your standard like transformation delivery team, you'll have your project, your program manager, etc. There'll be your PMO functions that will support you, and maybe your internal IT departments, etc. But I think on the business side, if we think about the BA and more on the actual doing side, I tend to refer to them as your subject matter experts. People call them different things, but the doers, the people who know things, the guys who run the processes, run the activities. I always find they're the core group of people that I'll look to engage with to try and find things out. And I guess that's still the same if you lift yourself up into a senior or a lead role. But I do think that introduces a new set of people to you in terms of groups. And you're probably looking more at the sponsor level, not more slightly senior and more exec level, especially, some personal experiences of mine that sort of branches out into like a C-suite as well in terms of engagement. So whilst I think at the core, you have got that, what I'll call that, those subject matter experts in the business out there doing stuff. I think if you are adopting a more senior role, then that could broaden it to slightly higher levels, let's say.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, good. Excellent start, Lee. Thank you very much. Orla.
Same question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, I have a really broad range of stakeholders. When I go through, at the moment, our program is running in 6-month stints. So in the space of 6 months, I can probably deal with 20 individuals. So it can range from, the internal stakeholders, from subject matter experts, very similar, I guess, really, senior executives, depending on what we're looking at, through to disaster management agencies, the directorate, and then we have regional partners. We'll have NGOs that we might partner up with and that might host us on deployments as well. So we'll deal with academic institutes as well. So we consult a lot as well with other bodies. It's quite a wide range.
It definitely seems the case. I mean, just a pair of you there, the amount of different groups that you've both shared, and I'll add a couple to it, but it's very evident that a number of different stakeholders that we can engage with through business analysis or similar is typically quite broad and can depend on the circumstance, of course. I think you obviously both shared some really excellent examples, so I won't repeat those. But for me, I think there's typically like the program governance type teams or centre of excellence, whether they're BA or process or similar. They're always useful teams to engage, particularly as a consultant. I tend to end up working for different organisations, so I don't always know what structures are in place, what expectations, standards, templates, all of that good stuff. So having access to those groups and contacting them is always a good way to find out, there's certain tools, templates, or practices that I can follow rather than create it myself on the fly when they've already done the hard work, as it were. So I probably add those groups to it. I think as well we tend to work with other teams who might be located on similar projects or quite different projects. So if there's other BAs in the area, I sort of refer to those in some ways as a stakeholder, because again, I want to find out if they've worked on similar projects, if they know the stakeholders, if there's certain approaches that they might be able to share with me that I can leverage as well. But as you can see, I'm sort of skirting around the edges. You've definitely, you've picked the key peoples like sponsors, the execs, and the SMEs.
Well, for me as well, the primary beneficiaries are at the end of the day the people who are most affected. The people actually on the ground that are affected by the cyclones and whatever hazards we identify. So that was something important I neglected to mention. Yeah.
We're probably saying for all of us as well, customers as well. We mustn't forget them as stakeholders. Especially if we're lucky enough to have like a stakeholder, a customer representative, or direct access to the customers or people affected as well. So yeah, thanks for chipping in and reminding us of that, or adding your own. So I mean, how do you? I'll ask this question to you first of all, in terms of how do your stakeholders' particular needs? How does that shape your analysis approach?
Particular needs. I guess, how do I address their particular needs and shape the approach? I guess it's what I like to look at the power and influence, I guess, on the project, and looking at who has like a high interest and high influence. I will, address the program managers and sponsors and donors. To has high influence, maybe low interest, like senior executives that will want to keep the communications brief and ensure that we're compliant with strategy and just key decision making information. Whereas the first group is very strategic as well, as about impact assessment. Then there's the low influence, maybe high interest groups, like those that I'm gathering for workshops, where I'm gathering more detailed information and I'm collecting user stories, doing some journey mapping just to capture their needs and just make sure, ensure that all their concerns are represented. And then I've got subject matter experts that I will consult with periodically. So that's the low interest, low influence group that really depends on the project that I'm approaching, which technical experts I'll consult with. So that's more like periodic updates and that sort of thing. Yeah.
I think that's a very strong start there in terms of that question. So thank you, Orla. Lee, what should be your perspective on the same question?
Yeah, I think very similar tact really to what Orla said, in terms of, especially in terms of that power and influence grid. I think a lot of mine tends to influence in terms of, I guess, stage of engagement as well. I think we briefly touched on it there, but if you're getting into like discovery, old feasibility type of things, that the needs are going to change, as opposed to if you're in the full flow of a delivery and going through like alpha beta phase. So I think that'll tend to slightly change me tact in terms of how I'll communicate with them, the various engagement methods I'll use, depending on seniority, etc. I think we briefly touched on it, the communication style might change. It might be a lot more brief, sharp, to the point, whereas you might want to get a lot more into the detail on one-on-one sessions with some of your SMEs and broaden that into bigger groups for your workshops, etc. So I think who the stakeholders are and what phase I'm at will tend to drive the sort of approach that I have, I think.
And with your response there, I mean, it shows that, you know, as a BA, we have to have a somewhat open mind on our approach in terms of the analysis itself, because actually it can be shaped by stakeholders. But to Orla's point, it's not just your analysis; it's things like reporting on your analysis and feeding into your execs and seniors as well. Even that can actually change from project to project or person to person that you're engaging with.
Yeah, it's the type of input as well. Sometimes I deal with a lot of technical stakeholders as well. So the style of information that they want can vary a lot. Some people prefer dashboards and data-driven reports, whereas other people who are like non-technical stakeholders, where you have like humanitarian partners, it's much more about visual representations, really. You know, trying to keep it short and to the point, but less detail.
Yeah. And that, I mean, that as well, I mean, makes you think about those situations where, you know, the type of analysis that you're doing can actually, the type of analysis can mean you speak to a certain type of stakeholder. And again, that's obviously informing the way that your analysis might happen based on some of the things you said before. You know, so whether we're looking at data or we're looking at dashboards or screens, or workflows or something completely different. They can all have a slightly different approach, but that can also be impacted by the stakeholder. And I think as well, I mean, sometimes as well, some of the ways that stakeholders influence the way I might do the analysis is their change experience, as well as their levels as well. But if I stick to change experience, you know, it's about, you know, I can't necessarily just expect that I'm going to use maybe some tried and tested techniques. I still might be able to do that. I probably can do that, but I need to at least plan to take my stakeholders with me on that journey and give them a bit of insight as to what techniques I'm using, how to interpret it, at least at a reasonably high level anyway. I think beyond that as well, I think you might have mentioned it, Orla, as well. I mean, technology, you know, stakeholders, they often have an impact on the way that I end up doing my analysis. You know, so for example, we've got a technical team that working in a very waterfall manner, then my analysis will be quite different than if we've got a tech team who are working in a very agile way itself. But even that doesn't make it as simple. There's only 2 or 3 options. I mean, obviously, you've got different teams in technology who might operate agile in different ways, and they might have, you know, different constructs of teams or pods or squads or sizes that can all have an influence on the way I might need to approach the analysis. Not necessarily the techniques, maybe, but certainly, I guess, the way I orchestrate the analysis to be done or schedule it. Yeah, but yeah, I feel like in that we've covered the fact. I mean, we've obviously started from the first question in terms of the number of broad stakeholders that we could get involved in, which I know there will be others that we you know, obviously haven't touched on. Recognizing that depending on the stakeholder, their needs, their approach, their style can all have an impact on the way we might do analysis for different reasons. And I wonder, I mean, perhaps, I mean, I know Orla, you've already mentioned the power and influence grid as a technique. But I wonder, I'll put this question to Lee, whether, you know, there are techniques that you might use when it comes to stakeholder management.
All stole me thunder, because my predominant one is the power influence I'll stakeholder map, and I've just been doing it today actually with a delivery manager on a new piece that we've started to try and get that context and start to manage our engagement piece across the corporate services that we're looking at the moment. But I think it is a very commonly used because it's very good. It does what it says on the tin. It doesn't. It's very much a case of you've got that landscape, that context that you're entering, and identifying these people. It's like, right, how am I going to manage them? How am I going to portion them in certain categories so I know how to deal with them? And you can do that to an extent, and I think you will get to a point where even within that upper quadrant or that bottom left one, you will treat individuals slightly differently because, you know, they are individuals. You can't apply the same thing. But I think technique-wise, I would be 99.9%. That is my go-to. And I might drift off in terms of visual representation of that, or, you know, slightly different if I'm discussing that with someone and they've got a different interpretation. But that's my stock, I would say.
One I'm trying to get more into, sorry, John, I didn't mean to cut across you, is Catwall as well. I just find, I'm trying to find opportunities to use it more, because I find just understanding people's motivations is can be really telling about how they're actually going to, what's their worldview, especially the worldview part. I really like that, because that can differ so much from one stakeholder to another. And I just think it's a really, really useful technique. It can catch so many aspects. Yeah.
I mean, it's always reassuring on this session to hear sort of that people are using the techniques that are out there. And it seems a bit of an odd thing to say, because obviously there are techniques out there. They're in a lot of the BA books, and the IIBA and BCS will prescribe using these techniques. But it's it's really positive that actually you're sort of reaffirming the value of them, and that I also I use these stakeholder matrix or stakeholder list that you refer to. I do use the power and influence grid as well. And I think it just sort of shows the importance of them as very useful techniques to be able to map out who your stakeholders are and have a view as to how engaged and interested or influential that they're going to be, as an example. And the Cat12 one is quite an interesting one, because it at least gives us it's a way for us to remind or be reminded of the different perspectives that we need to use for our stakeholders might occupy as well, to make sure we're not just going to the same type of stakeholder, getting the same view as a result. Which prompts me to sort of definitely not repeat your two or your examples, and one or two of them there, but add a couple of my own. I think as a technique, I think stakeholder interviews, very, very sort of complementary to the techniques you both outlined. They're always a good way to take an opportunity to introduce the project or the initiative or the product that you're working on, introduce yourself if you've not met them, and find out, what their experience is, what their needs are, what they'd like to see from you, or perhaps even, as I tend to, try and ask if they've been on previous projects, what have they received that they want more of, or what have they not liked about the experience. And it's always a really useful bit of insight, so that I don't try and repeat the things that have caused them some pain in the past rather. So it's a very quick win to appear like you really know what you're doing, is if you're learning from the stakeholders when they tell you already that there's things they don't like or they haven't worked well before you arrived. So I find that particularly useful. And also I'll chuck one more in. I think for me, having business process or utilising business process is always really useful in these situations, because just if they happen to be in an environment where there is a predefined process that I can look at, then at least it gives me a chance to think, well, maybe there's some different swim lanes or teams that I have to go and get representation from, or maybe at least I can get some context behind the things and processes or activities that these individuals are working on as well. So that's a very useful tool. But I will jump on your bandwagon as well, because I use the two that you mentioned there as a power, influence, and a stakeholder list as my go-tos at all times anyway. Excellent. So I mean, so Orla, how do you? We've obviously gone through a few questions to help figure out who our stakeholders are, and how to identify them, how to maybe organise them in our stakeholder matrix and lists. How do you start to build trust with your stakeholders and build relationships with them?
Building trust. Well, I think it helps a lot to be transparent, and to be able to demonstrate reliability is really important to get going. How it shows, have some really lay out very clear expectations from the beginning, and be accountable. Be accountable when not everything goes well. There are delays, but it's important not to avoid being. It's important to be accountable ultimately, and proactive. I think proactivity is really important, to just get ahead of niggling things. I think as VAs we have this ability to hover over and step a bit outside of the project and see the dependencies and where they're starting to develop bottlenecks, and to just get in ahead of problems. I think is really, really important, not to get too blinkered. Aside from demonstrating competence, which is really important for project kickoffs, and depending on the level stakeholder that I'm dealing with. You know, showing credibility, really, credibility is important. And, being able to demonstrate data-driven insights as well can go a long way to building that credibility. I think being adaptable as well is, you know, is really important. I think in you know, in the sector that I'm in, we're working with multiple compound hazards, really. So dealing with stakeholders that are literally in the environment, that are being pounded by cyclones or whatever hazard, you know, come along. We have to be able to adapt to their schedule. We have to be able to build in that understanding when they need to go out in the field for a week. You know, and a project just needs to, you know, we need to just build in that eventuality. So that always happens. And consistency, you know, consistency as well. It's just, you know, it's I like to try and pre-plan the meetings and get them pre-booked, you know, regular touch points in on a weekly basis when I've got this project developing, so that people can see it coming and we can just move things around and just, you know, we're doing the same thing at the same time, preferably every week, and it just sort of builds it into everyone's head that we are now a part of this team. It's not something that just happens for that 45-minute session and then, you know, shut down. It goes out of people's minds again. I find that's really helpful. But you know, ultimately, we're dealing with people, with human beings, you know, and it's really nice to just get to know the person, you know, show some interest in them. We very, you know, rarely when we're in the setup get to meet as many people that I'm involved. But there's always a, you know, a couple of minutes before the meeting, you know, when everybody's waiting for people to join. It's just have that kind of human conversation and show some interest in the person and ask some questions. And it can really help, you know, even with language barriers, you know, dealing with people all over the world, learning a few words of their language can make a massive difference. So yeah, stuff like that.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, so many interesting points and all very relatable. So yeah, absolutely agree. Lee.
Yeah, I'm in the same vein as that. I think forming effective relationships as soon as you can is really key. You know, I tend to think of it like as a foundation of the house. It's that bottom layer that you need to get to know these people, because ultimately you want trust and confidence in yourself from them. Especially when you try and obtain information. Yes, we're there to help and try and deliver change for their benefit, but ultimately we want to know what makes them tick. We want to get to know them, like Orla says, that you have those opportunities whereby get to know them a little bit, know them as a person, as well as the role and the job, you know, understand the circumstances, what's going on around them, professionally, predominantly. I mean, maybe personal circumstances as well, but, you know, just showing that bit more empathy, you know, like Orla's mentioned as well, we are human and we are dealing with humans. It's a very people-centric role, isn't it? So I think if people can see that you've got a level of understanding of them as a person on a personal level as well as professional, I think the more inclined to, and he said to give more, but you know, to share more, to like give you what you need. And you know, if you are trying to coax someone around to a bigger picture view, or you know, your way of thinking, there's a lot of credit in the bank for you there, by doing that. You know, a lot of the words Orla said about the trust or the reliability, you know, being dependable, you know, it's things people look for to say, do you know what, actually they're a good egg. I'll trust them. Yeah, I'm with them on this. So definitely so.
Yeah, and I mean they're all really relatable points that you both made, and I think it's what's interesting in it. And you know, they're most of my points I've written down as well. Actually, it was interesting, but I think it's almost you can flip it around and think, how would I like to be treated, and how would I like people to behave to me? And actually, many of the points, probably all of them, actually they mentioned, probably resonate in that sense. You know, and I think, you know, being consistent, to name a couple of points, delivering what you promise, you know, being a bit personal as well, and not just being like quite transactional in your dealings with people. For me, is something that I always appreciate. You know, I think with that in mind, you know, taking time to know your stakeholders, to try and be interested in them and actually what their actual problems are or what their opinions are as well, is really key. And I think, if you build on that, because I mean, basically it's primarily conversations that we're having, and if we're open to listening to the stakeholders and we care about what they're saying, and we then take that accountability that you mentioned, Orla, then feels like we'll represent the stakeholder as best we can, and at least if there are situations that crop up where we can't deliver exactly what the stakeholder needs, we're at least put ourselves in a position where we're treating them like people, and we can actually go back to them and explain to them, what decisions have been made, what outcomes they might expect, maybe why something's not being delivered straight away, and try and then find a happy medium rather than it being a negative outcome. Anyway.
It's intuitive, isn't it? I think you do have to tailor your way of communicating as well, depending on which level obviously you're dealing with, because you're not going to establish trust with someone at a high level if you don't understand or respect the cultural sensitivities as well. How people address each other in the team in the other country, for example, can speak volumes about how they want to be addressed themselves too. So it really it's really about adaptability and just having the intuition, I think, is really important. I think as BAs we're quite intuitive beings, can pick up on those signals pretty early on.
In that sense, at least we know if a style not working for somebody, we can correct course and actually alter our style a little bit. Which again makes me think, sometimes we can just, or not sometimes, all the time, we can ask people who we're working with, how would you prefer to be, for me to reach out to you and interact, because some people might prefer, picking the phone up or wandering to their desk if you're able to, whereas others, their preference might be to pop them a note or a message or a text and they can come back to you later, so I think these are all important points that you can only really gather by speaking to somebody and waiting to hear what they've got to say. I think some excellent points, which I'll definitely not bore everyone by repeating. They can, of course, rewind and play the video again, and they'll see exactly those points mentioned. So I guess the next question I have is really how you might prioritise competing needs, because sometimes we'll speak to stakeholders who might have different opinions or different requirements, or just they want different things. And I wonder, Orla, how do you manage stakeholders in those situations where there is a conflict?
Well, it's quite useful to use the catalog again in this context, because it helps you kind of create that Venn diagram, if you like, on how people intersect, with what they want out of a situation. And I think using something like a RAID log is really useful as well. You can see something developing and you can kind of flag it and keep an eye on it. And, again, using the intuition, I love the intuition. You can pick up on tensions even within a team sometimes, where you get one story from one person and then you meet, you have an interview with someone else on the team the following week. And you have sometimes that hippo effect too, in a workshop. You've got a very senior person who other team members are just maybe reluctant to speak up in their presence. So picking up on conflicting requirements, conflicting needs is really all about those interviews. I think those individual interviews are really helpful because they give people that freedom to relax and actually give you their honest viewpoint on something once the trust is built up. And that can help a lot. But I think, stepping out of dealing directly with the people concerned, I think it's really useful to ask for help as well. I think don't be afraid to ask for help and actually consult with your, with your own team, and maybe with stakeholders that you trust in the shared environment as well. Because where other teams and other maybe third-party partners may have worked with this team before, and they may have some insight to give you on possibly a previous project that they've worked on together, and they might be able to give you more of the, the history of the issue. So it's really all about perspectives, isn't it? And being a BA is all about understanding everybody's perspectives and trying to remain as neutral as possible, while trying to hash them out, really, So I think, in managing the conflict, trying to stay as neutral and as calm and not get emotionally involved. It's always can be a challenge in some situations. I think it's about knowing the level of the conflict and knowing when you need to escalate as well, who you need to involve, keeping line management well informed of how things are going. And I suppose not being afraid to pause a project if you think that it's heading for a dead end, even if it's a couple of months down the line. I think it's good to step back and say, put the pause button on and say, I think before we can continue with this, we do need to resolve X, Y, and Z. Can be really, really beneficial and can be a bit of a brave step. Sometimes I think it's necessary.
Step back is really, really key, isn't it? It's easy to forget sometimes when you're in the weeds that actually you need to give yourself a bit of space to consume and digest the information, or to even maybe ask colleagues how they might approach the situation if you need to. I think that's really important. And what come across from the very start of that response is about being adaptable to the situation as well. Can really, is also essential. As you mentioned. Lee, what would be your view on that same question?
Yeah, I've got a lot of similarities. I think for me, it's I'd lean on people to understand context and history as well, because things do develop over a period of time, which in my role, if I'm new into something, I might not have that narrative, that history behind it. So finding that out is good. And I think when I've got competing needs and priorities from stakeholders, and I've got that information, I've done that gathering, I can understand different perspectives. I'd always look back and see what we're actually trying to achieve here. So what's, I hate to use the phrase, look at the bigger picture here, but let's understand what benefit we're trying to deliver and say, okay, John, I appreciate whilst you're focusing on this and consider this, whereas all is coming from this, let's look at what this will give us overall as opposed to just in this space, and to try and get people to think about that differently. I always use the phrase like, let's look at it in someone else's shoes. Because, like you say, when we're down in the detail, we're very focused on what we want. Let's lift ourselves up and look at it from some different perspectives and see how that impacts it. Because just because it's great in your space doesn't necessarily mean that's a positive impact or a positive change for someone else. It could be to the detriment. And I think it was an important point about knowing when to step back, knowing when to accept help and seek for it. We can't fix everything. That's why we tend to have a team of people, and we tend to be part of that. And it's knowing when to use those people is really useful and handy. And there's one specific point which I just wanted to pick up and continue, which Orla made, was about that. Don't be afraid to pause it. I think we're all about delivering change and delivering benefit, but there's also value in what we do in how we engage with stakeholders to say, actually, I know you believe in this, but the information, what I'm hearing, what I'm understanding, what I'm working out, this is telling me this is wrong to do. We shouldn't be doing this. We could have potentially a lot more disbenefit than benefit. So, putting the brakes on and being prepared to have those conversations is important as as pushing the go button and going ahead with things. So.
Yeah, it builds on that point you both made earlier on about transparency as well. So if you can sort of show, not just that stakeholder's perspective and play that back to them, but how what you've learned from that stakeholder fits in with everything else that you've learned, can give them a different perspective. So for example, if they might recognise a problem exists for them, but if everyone else has a slightly different experience, then maybe the solution needs to be a little bit different than they might imagine. But granted, every stakeholder will want a little bit of something for themselves as well, I imagine. They need some benefit as well. But yeah, some really really interesting points there, I would say. I think really for me to build on that, I would just say, sometimes I think that maybe the BAs can be the area of conflict or the reason for the conflict sometimes. And the reason I say that is because I might speak to a stakeholder one week who I've not met before. They give me some information. I'll speak to another stakeholder later who has a slightly different perspective. And I'm hearing information I've not heard before maybe I'm interpreting it slightly differently, and it might come across that there's a conflict. But if I was more expert in the situation or understood the stakeholders a bit more than I did, that I might have a different view. So with that in mind, I tend to try and use that as my default position. So rather than assume that one stakeholder is vehemently disagreeing with another, that I would tend to assume that maybe it's me taking a slightly different view of what each has said. So with that in mind, that encourages me to bring those conflicting stakeholders together, share what I believe I've heard from both of them, and actually find out exactly what they meant. And in fairness, it doesn't always result in me recognising it is purely me making a mix-up. But I think it's quite a nice way to approach the situation without putting blame on one person or another to be right or wrong. And there's plenty of times as well where I have learned it is actually the way that I've understood the same information that might have been given to me in a slightly different way or with different terminology. As you see, two people who really know what they're talking about, the SMEs, come together, they discuss it amongst themselves, and you can see that they might use different terms, but they both recognise exactly what it is that they're referring to, because maybe they're a bit more familiar with the term as well. So that can help. Data as well is always a useful way to back things up, which is and maybe the last thing as well. I think it's something that I think you might have said earlier on, or that prompts me to think about this, is in terms of taking maybe the organisational view as well, that when there's a conflict. So you've got two stakeholders that have a different opinion. There's possibly one opinion that is more beneficial to the overall organisation, and if that's the case, I think they'll understand why you take that decision rather than take theirs. But plenty of food for thought, I think, for anyone that finds themselves in a situation where there's a little bit of conflict. There normally is, but as hopefully they're hearing, it's never something too fundamental that you can't overcome. And even if you can't, as Lee said, bring someone else in that might be able to navigate it a little bit better than you for that one situation. All right, so I guess so. Probably the last question really is whether communication style has any impact when it comes to stakeholder management, and if so, how do you adopt a different communication style as you deal with stakeholders? And I'll put that really easy question to you firstly.
Thanks, John. You could probably talk about the formality of your communication, I guess, depending on who you're dealing with. I think regardless of level, my first engagement with the stakeholder, the first thing that comes out tends to be, "Oh, you're not from around here." It just comes out in the accent. I guess all of you'll find the same as well, and it just sparks a topic of conversation, and it sets the tone for that. And I think, we've mentioned before, we're quite intuitive people, so we can sort of sense what's working and what's not very quickly. We could pick up on signs, we could pick up on facial expressions, everything like that. So whilst if I'm dealing with SMEs, you still maintain a level of respect, but you might just be a bit more relaxed. You might be just be a bit more informal because you want to make them a bit more comfortable in that situation with you. If you're running up the tree a bit further and there's presentations, there's very short agenda items that you've got time for quite serious meetings, you might be a bit more formal. Your tone, your language might change a bit. I think you've just got to be adaptable, because whilst you might have a preconception of how you're going to deal with someone, once you get in that situation, it could be completely different. I've experienced that personally myself. I'm sure yourselves have as well, whereby you think, yeah, I'm walking into a boardroom in effect here. I've got a 5-minute slot to do this presentation. I need to get this and this done. And you go in and it's the complete opposite. It feels like you're walking into a social room or you're walking into a bar type thing, and the environment just feels completely different to what you thought. So you've got to be quite quick, quite flexible, and be able to adapt to that.
I think there's even situations, Lee, where you get an individual and their style isn't always consistent. I mean, it makes me think of examples where, I might speak to a stakeholder like through Zoom or over the phone, and they behave a certain way, or maybe we get on lukewarm, as it were, because we're not so we don't see each other in person. But then you see them in person, and you realise they're quite a different person when they're face to face, and therefore maybe the way you might naturally have adapted your style, you need to adapt again to pick something a little different, you know. And it's not, I mean, hopefully it always goes in a nice way. People adapt their styles to be nicer, but I'm sure that isn't the case. So probably need to adapt our style appropriately. Orla, what would be your view on that same question about adapting your style?
Yes, I mean, all of what you've said. Leah, you mentioned tone as well, and that really resonates with me, pardon the pun. But tone can send such a message, you know. I mean, just we're used to doing video calls a bit more now, especially since pandemic. But before then it was telephone, and I'm dealing with a lot of stakeholders that don't like to show their face on calls. Yeah, they don't like to show their face on video. So you're really reliant on voice a lot. So the tone that people are using, you can't compensate you can't see the body language, and that's it sets you at a disadvantage really. So you get quite good at listening to people's tone and the inflections, and because I deal a lot with people who speak other languages. English is not their native language, of course. Needing to listen actively is incredibly important. So active listening and reflecting back, on what I have perceived is coming out of the conversation is really, really helpful, because it keeps me knowing where I am in the conversation, and helps them to build the trust again in me. To adapt to whatever way the conversation is going. Being clear and precise as well. I'm a terrible waffler, so I struggle with this all the time. So I like to have a little bit of a chat, but it's not always helpful, in certain situations, because you don't always know initially what people's language capacity is, and having an Irish accent as well sometimes can be more helpful, because maybe it sounds a bit more American. It may be more what they're used to watching on TV or hearing on TV, but sometimes not. Really depends on the country I'm dealing with. So there's that. There's again, the cultural sensitivity is really important as well. Just being sensitive to some countries' manners of speech with gender is important as well in some cases. So there's it's endless adaptability, I think, really with communicating in the humanitarian sector for sure. And then again, adapting to who you're speaking with. Are you dealing with technical operational teams that really want that detailed information? Are you dealing with maybe somebody who's more, in a compliancy role where they're looking for accuracy, so it's, or you have this cross-functional function as well as a BA, when you're dealing with all different types of people in the room at the same time, so I kind of have a workshop, like I did in Madagascar earlier this year, or last year, where I had so many different role types in the room, and there was a lot of adaptability, to do at the same time, and in French, which was a bit of a challenge for me. My French is not that great, but yeah, I think it's ultimately about just being flexible, and again coming back to the same old intuition, using your intuition to know when you need to make that change.
Yeah, I would totally agree, and I mean, some excellent points around communication style, adapting your style. I think what I would add, it all relates to being adaptable and taking different perspectives, as we said, but just maybe like being willing to learn from others, because I've certainly can think of a number of occasions over the years where maybe I didn't necessarily recognise I could have been better at communicating at that point, but I'll see people that really are good at communicating with stakeholders, and really they're good, really able to build up a relationship with certain individuals, maybe that I hadn't quite built that rapport with. So just observing the way they interact, the way they behave, and trying to take some of those lessons and apply them myself has been really useful. I think A few terms come to mind when I think about that. I mean, someone once told me to drown stakeholders with kindness if they're a bit difficult. I think that's advice that definitely applies. I think sometimes it is appropriate to treat stakeholders, based on their level. I think in a certain way, and they sometimes expect it. But equally, there's times when you've got to try and nullify that and not speak to them as if you would any differently, irrespective of what their level is. So it goes to show that maybe this conversation is like the tip of the iceberg for some in terms of how to communicate with stakeholders. But hopefully, some of the key things we've talked about today, the lessons you've shared about being adaptable, being willing to speak to your stakeholders, being willing to learn and listen, and active listening, as you were saying a minute ago, Orla. They're all steps in the right direction for any BA learning to trying to improve themselves. So I feel like that's probably a good place to bring this session to an end, but not necessarily stakeholder engagement to an end, I should definitely say. So with that, it's probably all that's left to say is thank you, Lee. Thank you, Orla, for your time, sharing your insights. Found it really, really insightful and interesting as I expected. And as I said as well at the start, if anyone watching this has got anything they want to share, either to complement what you've said or to share their own experience, I'd like to hear what they've got to say as well. All right, thank you both.
Thanks for that, John.
Thanks, John.